It might be interesting today to talk about freedom. It means a lot to me, the word freedom. But when I use the word freedom, for myself, it means self. Being in the one as pure meditation. So sitting here now, as I look out, it's a very lovely scene, the blue sky and the light on all the buildings and the trees. Lighting up the red bricks, the gold-coloured stones of the castle, and the red Virginia creeper, and the green birch trees. Sitting here, I just feel free. And to me, that's a very simple fact. And all of the talk about spirituality in this moment is irrelevant. So everything I'm going to say now, and everything I've ever written, and everything I've ever said to do with my spiritual life is irrelevant. And yet, in the world we live in, it means everything. What you say, what you think, what you write, what you know. That is life for most people in their consciousness. So, from my earliest awakening at the age of 23, when I was pretty much all the time with this sense of freedom, over time I did take on a spiritual identity. It was like, in a way, the self remains the self in the one, in pure meditation. But in consciousness, you might say the spirit gets caught by the butterfly catcher. So you catch yourself, you tie yourself down, you have to become somebody in the world. That, I think, is almost inevitable. Because if you're 100% anonymous and you're simply self in the oneness of meditation, then no one would ever know about you anyway. So I'm addressing myself and other people within the context of spirituality, which is the kind of known world, the cultural world. So you could say the soul of the self, i.e. the psyche, the butterfly, gets caught in the web of Maya. The net of Maya, which is consciousness. And there must be a reason for that. I mean, there's a reason why the self is incarnate. When I say the self is incarnate, I mean you're aware of yourself in this reality which has a body and a psyche, i.e. consciousness being the kind of interface between body and psyche. So however we got here, I think self doesn't reside here. In fact, self in essence right now isn't actually here in the literal sense of the word. It's not in the body and it's not in the psyche consciousness. That doesn't cause me any problem. To be in the emptiness of the one doesn't cause me any problem. And I certainly don't know what happened before my birth. I have no memory of that. So I can't refer to an objective transcendental level of the one, which I think does exist. And I think Buddha left his body and went there. But there is a communion between self in the one incarnate and self in the one discarnate. But I can't talk about that because I don't really know about that, only in theory, as it were. So anyway, how I look at it is we've got work to do. Human beings have got work to do. Not only to survive in the natural world physically, but to produce the fruits of culture. So even spirituality is culture, and you have to bear fruit. You have to work on your spiritual nature within consciousness. So whether you like it or not, the world demands an identity. And as I say, if there are people that are 100% anonymous, then you'll never know about them. So, being self in freedom, and yet having to bear with the fact of identity, which is limited to consciousness and all of its problems, because consciousness inherently is a problem, or contains myriad problems that can't actually be solved by consciousness. So it's in a vicious cycle. I mean, every single person in the world, in society and culture, is trying to solve the problem of their own existence, and then never solve the problem. So only self in freedom, you might say, is liberated from the conditions of consciousness that, in a sense, trap the identity, or is synonymous with identity, which you have to become in order to function in the world. So as I'm speaking now and spontaneously thinking through what I'm going to say about conditioning, about identity, about ego, about limitation, about feeling trapped in your life condition, I know that that's a problem with no solution within the language I'm speaking. So if you read poetry, or you look at art and listen to music, and what the politicians are saying, what the scientists are saying, what the spiritual texts say, all of that does not provide freedom. So it's a kind of infinite extension of the problem produced by consciousness and the conditions of reality, or the world you live in, and they will go on indefinitely into the future. wherever human beings go, on other planets, other solar systems, etc. And that kind of story, as it were, being lived out by every human being, and you think, well, when did it begin and when did it end? Well, in a sense, it begins with incarnation. I mean, the idea that the self is incarnated into a consciousness means the story begins then. The child begins telling its own story, and you think of the universe, then all intelligences like ourselves are trapped in that story, and you call that story karma. And you call karma fate. So we're all fated to do the work of karma, work on yourself, self-examination, self-inquiry, self-knowledge, it's all the same thing. And realizing that there is no freedom, however much you elucidate ideas in science, in politics, in religion, whatever, and yet somebody like Krishnamurti spent at least 30 years going around the world talking about freedom from the known, freedom from conditioning. And he says that he's like a flower by the wayside, he's just a flower, and you can pay attention to what he's saying or not. And that's true, because you can go into a library or not, you can go into an art gallery or not, you can go into the forest or not. But that sense of choice is really an illusion. So it's not, I am making a choice. You're in the field of choice. You're in the field of determinism, necessity, fate. So really, there is no free choice. Only within a relative context. So if you're in a house, yeah, you can choose to have coffee or tea. Great, great. Of course, that's all right on that level. But if you think you can choose to be free as a self or not, that's not possible. So all self-inquiry, self-examination leads to a dead end. And yet, that's what we're all doing. The book comes to an end, the film comes to an end, and your life comes to an end. You can't give another freedom. So when I've said before about Buddha holding up a flower and enlightening a couple of people, I tried to show that that wasn't self in nirvana, self in the one. That was what you might call mirror-like reflection, in the sense that the Buddha nature or the aspects of the Godhead, like the Bodhisattvas and the Buddhas of meditation, I think what Buddha did was simply illuminate that, or reflect his own nature through the vehicle of the flower, and awakened that nature in his cousin and his friend. But he couldn't act on the self, he couldn't act on the one, because he's in the one, and in the one of emptiness there is no action, there is no transmission, there is no communion, there's nothing. So literally even the Buddha can't do a single thing. So what does it mean to transmit the Buddha nature, as it were, or the Buddha essence? So if I can't give you freedom, then the next best thing, as it were, is what they call gift waves or grace waves. And the Buddhas of meditation simply represent the extension of meditation out of the one through what they call the Sambhoga Kaya, the body of perfect endowment. So, in a sense, the Buddhas of meditation, or the Bodhisattvas, contain the Buddha nature, such as love and beauty and truth and justice and all-discriminating wisdom, mirror-like wisdom, Bodhic or enlightened insight, the aspect of the third eye, or the eye of Buddha. So I remember my nephew was probably about 8 years old. And I kind of mentored him, not with any intention other than just to put him in touch with culture, literature and various other things. But I do remember actually speaking to him and found that he was really thinking in a very, very subtle way about some of the things I was talking about to do with spirituality. So what I would say might happen in that context is that there could be an attunement, as it were, between, say, myself as a spiritual teacher, in the sense of using my Buddha nature to communicate, say, an element of truth to my nephew, and he attunes to that, and that awakens his own Buddha nature. And it's interesting that he did go on to be very bright, got a degree in artificial intelligence, etc., and was very deeply into synchronicity, partly through my influence, but definitely that he was, I would say, or is now, quite aware of that level of meditation, that level of the Buddha nature. So I think and they do talk about transmission, and that you can transmit the gift waves or grace waves into the psyche of another. so that two people like myself and my nephew, or possibly some discarnate spiritual teacher, guru, can transmit into the psyche of people on the earth necessary wisdom that will awaken their sense of insight and understanding, so that they can self-inquire and do self-examination. But I would consciously not really think in that way today. So if I'm in conversation with somebody, I don't think about myself. I don't want to know the kind of person I am. I don't want to be self-conscious. I don't want to well, it's very interesting actually that myself, the self, myself, can not be conscious. That means consciousness, that means identity, that means being self-conscious. I can literally not know I'm in the one, not know that I'm empty, not know that I'm in meditation. And in that freedom of myself, by implication it would mean that I am not reflecting that fact in my consciousness. I mean, a bird, if you see a bird flying around, you know, I mean, it's being a bird. So I would say in the one, in pure meditation, you're just being yourself. So when I'm walking down the river, I'm no different from anyone else. I'm just being myself. They're being themselves and I'm being myself. Now, whether they're self-aware or not, or they're, or they're in their ego, that's no concern of mine. I'm not going to think about other people, whether they're in their ego or not. So as far as I'm concerned, we're the same. Whether that's literally true or not, it doesn't make any difference to me. So if I talk to somebody, if they're in, you know, they have a sense of self-awareness or not, and whether they think I've got self-awareness or not, it's irrelevant to me. I mean, my friend comes over, we talk for about 4 hours, and he's a Jungian scholar, so he knows all about spirituality. And the thought would never occur to me that he's any different from me. And I don't concern myself with his interior world. We just communicate and everything's in order, everything works well, and we go deeply into things. And I consider him intelligent, I consider him operating from the level of spiritual insight. Now, whether he's self-aware in the one, I don't know, and it's not really something I can know anyway in that sense. So he went to Oxford University, got a very high IQ, etc. But he's also intelligent. And I mean by that, I'm just distinguishing intellectual IQ, whether you're a scientist or whatever, from the fact of the intelligence. And that was a very key word for Krishnamurti. And I first saw my friend at a Krishnamurti conference in 1985, the year before Krishnamurti's death. And he and Professor Boehm were always talking about intelligence, insight, attention, and consciousness. They were trying to figure out the kind of mechanics of how these different processes work. That was what they actually talked about most of the time. I mean, over years and years and years. But they never used a religious language like Tibetan Buddhism. But if they had, they would have worked out what they were trying to work out much sooner, and in fact they never did work anything out, I don't think. Whereas if you knew Tibetan Buddhism, all of those concepts are crystal clear within the Tibetan Buddhist model. And also in the philosophy of Plotinus, the Neoplatonists, I think in the first century, he wrote about the one, and then the next level down, he talked about the intelligible world. So you think of the realm of intelligence as the Buddhas of meditation. So you're using enlightened insight. So in order to write, say, his philosophy, he himself would be using the intelligible, intelligent realm. He would be, you might say, incarnating Bodhic insight, the Buddha nature. So when scientists and other creative people in the arts and humanities, when they gain insight, by implication, they're operating from, you might say, a trance-conscious state. They're not acting from within the field of consciousness, which is simply repeating the pattern, so that you go to university, you learn about science, and then you teach science. It's kind of like a cycle. Whereas the scientist who's making the insight is operating from outside of consciousness. He's usually using deeper level subtle perceptions that I think come not from the psyche as such, but from another realm that interfaces between the psyche and the one. Because in Tibetan Buddhism they say that when you leave your body at death or before death into a kind of altered state or a dream state, you have to focus on the white light of nirvana, the clear light of the one mind. Then you won't be reborn on earth. Or if you don't go right into the light like Buddha, you go into the Sambhogakaya, the body of perfect endowment, where the Buddhas of meditation are, and then you become like a spiritual teacher or guru on that level. But there's no way of actually quite knowing where that level is. But I don't think it's synonymous with the psyche. It's what you might call the visionary realm. When you read sacred literature of East and West, you know, the enlightened people, the prophets, etc., you know, they often talk about the visionary realm. So when Jesus was transfigured himself and his face shone as the sun in front of his disciples, he told them not to tell other people about the vision they just had. So obviously they were in a visionary state when they saw Jesus transfigure. So in other words, he illuminated himself in the same way that you might say the Buddha held up a flower to his followers. And if you use the analogy of the golden flower, which is in alchemy, then that would be a symbol of illumination, and therefore the golden flower would be the same idea as the golden halo of the Buddha, or the transfiguration of Jesus' face that shone like the sun. So in that level, you might say, in the level of the Buddhas of meditation, you're not free absolutely in nirvana like the Buddha, and yet you're not limited to conditions in consciousness. That's why you can see through the veil of Maya. You can bypass the kind of vicious cycle of self-deception within consciousness, which is really a process of projecting an identity or an egocentric perspective. So those subtle perceptions can operate in someone, and in terms of the seer in pure meditation as the one, the subtle perceptions become the seeing, and what you're seeing is the essence of what you're perceiving in reality. So if you're looking at nature, you're the seer seeing. You're not the seer and the seen, but it's just pure seeing. And that seeing, you might say, is the seeing of beauty, is the seeing of order, is seeing the truth about nature, the creative nature of nature itself. And that's before it becomes culturally expressed. So you don't have because you're not identified in consciousness, you're not on the world stage acting out a form of self-expression, as it were. Then you might say these subtle perceptions of the objective nature of beauty, truth within the world of reality, as it were, that they're not recorded. Those kind of subtle perceptions remain with the seer. They're not recordable. So you might say the next level down from that is the genius that creates a painting, the genius that gains an insight into scientific matters. And then you're dealing with, you might say, the products and the fruits of culture, the fruits of consciousness itself. So yes, I'm sure there are many people walking around that have these subtle perceptions and remain anonymous. And my view is that every human being participates in those subtle perceptions. Which doesn't necessarily mean that you're self-aware in the essential nature of the one. So when people go to a concert and they share in the numinosity of the atmosphere, the space in which the music's being played, then you might say they're gaining access to the subtle perceptions, and that creates a sense of unity with the world around you, between the people, and a sense of communion, which of course is not necessarily talked about or even making use of that language, but I would say it's a fact of what happens when people relate to culture and to nature. They do have a sense of communion, they do have unitative awareness. And that's why it has so much value in people's lives. And another aspect of pure meditation and freedom is that you're free of experience. You have no need to experience. That means consciousness is in suspension. There's no identification, which is experience. So, in the field of consciousness, you use attention to focus on and identify an experience. You're looking at a tree, you identify it, you focus on it, your attention goes to that. When you're in meditation, there's no need to use consciousness at all, so that there is no workable attention to anything. There's no need to attend to anything. But if you want to attend to something, you can attend to something. You have access to your consciousness anytime you want it. I mean, if you've got a radio, you can switch it on and switch it off. If you want the music on, you have it on. If you don't, you don't. Or if you if you want to use your hand can be still, but as soon as you think you want to use your hand, you can use it. So if you're in meditation and you can just think, you can automatically just operate from that level of consciousness. I mean, I have been in conditions where I felt that my consciousness would, how can I say, not be available to me. I've not been in that state. I've been very, very close to that state and probably have lived on that threshold most of my life. but the idea of actually your consciousness just shutting down so that you may not have access to it. Because even if you go into altered states, you still are accessing your consciousness. So you go into the psyche, you take your consciousness with you, and you identify yourself within a dream. So it's still within the field of consciousness, and you can meditate in the limited sense of the meaning of meditation. That means pondering. You can meditate within your psyche and go all over the place and you're still fettered to your consciousness. Yeah, I think it was about 1974. I'd been living in Oxford and I decided I didn't want to stay there any longer. I literally got on a train, went down to Cornwall and met someone, and we decided to go to Greece. So we travelled by train across Europe and went to Greece. And from Greece I went to Germany, and I was walking around in Germany, in Frankfurt, and I suddenly became aware that my sense of identity was very fragile. Like, who am I, so to speak? Who am I in walking around in Frankfurt? But this wasn't like I wasn't thinking anything. I wasn't kind of identifying anything. I just felt that kind of threshold that I knew very well, and it was very intense. The sense that if I carried on walking and went around the corner of this building, I felt that I would lose my identity. I really felt that very profoundly. So you could say the corner was a kind of symbol of entering a different level, a different dimension, so to speak. So it's projected literally into the street. And like the idea of the death of the ego, in other words, consciousness was going to completely shut down. Your memory would shut down, so that when I went around the corner, there would be no reference point. Now at that time, I wouldn't have known how to handle that. So if I walked around the corner and I was self in pure meditation, without access to my consciousness, or the fear that I wouldn't have access to my consciousness, that's what prevented me from doing it. The fear that I wouldn't have access to my consciousness. And I'd forget who I was, where I was, to that extent. And I've never let that happen to me. That's been available, but I've never let that happen. Now, whether that's possible, that if I went through with that, whether I would still have access to my memory or not, I don't know. I don't actually know. because it's hard to conceive of that, because this was the problem that Jung had with Tibetan Buddhism. I mean, he wrote the psychological commentaries on the Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And he actually wrote that for the European is centered in their ego consciousness. And he couldn't conceive of the fact that you could enter nirvana free of your ego. Whereas in the East they say you can do that. Buddha did that. He freed himself from ego consciousness, and his true self was revealed within the one, as it were. So he found a problem with that. And that would be what I'm saying, really, is that for us in the West, the idea of losing your consciousness is like, you know, it's like death itself. I mean, our whole conditioning is not to regard that notion. It wouldn't even cross our minds to live in the world without our ego or a fixed identity. But still, it interests me. I mean, I know that I can have that dilemma presented to me again. So I wonder what I will do when it's presented to me again. I mean, that was in 1974 or such, and I've had it a number of times since then. I mean, animals, I think, function without a consciousness, and I think they live in the moment. There's no continuity in terms of consciousness. There's no continuity in the sense that they're thinking anything, or that their memory is operating in a kind of linear way in time. I mean, they use memory when they have to, but everything's habitual, and yet we know that they're functioning without consciousness. It's the same way if we built a robot and it can play chess better than any chess player, we know that it doesn't have a consciousness, it doesn't have a self-conscious identity. So you imagine the Buddha, if he had what they say was the trikaya, the three bodies, so he had the body of wisdom in nirvana, the one, he had the body of perfect endowment, the Buddha of meditation, or the Buddha nature, and then he had the nirmanakaya, the incarnate body. So, you know, the assumption is that when he was walking around, he could go into either, he could be focused in either body, so to speak. So I think it is possible for someone like the Buddha to be in pure meditation while he's in the world. And I mean, for myself, there's no kind of, you can't inquire into that, only to the point of that possibility. Then the only conclusion, or the only way you can actually understand that is to do that. There's no other way of knowing that. You can't know that. You have to do it. And that's the thing. You know, self in the one, self in pure meditation. Is beyond all philosophy. So if you read the books of philosophy and they meditate, ponder on the deepest levels of thought and knowledge and experience, in no way can they address the objective nature of the one or the objective nature of the self. And that's obviously metaphysically said of the contemplation of God. You can't really contemplate God, as it were. I mean, in the same way, you can't know the awareness of a child. I mean, even though you've been a child, you can't know the awareness of a child. I mean, in subtle perceptions, if we're bypassing consciousness at that moment of perception, or that moment of numinosity, that moment of illumination in a certain way, then I think we seem to be doing that. But of course, there's no question that consciousness is available. So if you're in a concert and you enter into these subtle perceptions, you're not freaking out that you're going to lose your consciousness. It just seems to be just you might say human nature. It's just the way we are. We can do that. Like they call peak experiences and stuff like that. Just like we go to sleep and we leave our body, or we go into the dream state. I mean, that's all fairly natural. So I think people do have subtle perceptions, and I think it's quite natural. It doesn't pose a problem. It's not traumatic, it's not radical, it's not a kind of mental abnormality. And then when you become when you are that sensitive, as we all are, I believe we're all intelligent, we're all working from the subtle perceptions, but we're primarily focused, our attention's focused in the consciousness, in the body, in the world, in society, and living and dying, that kind of thing. But when we read poetry and listen to music and walk in nature, then you could say that heightened awareness comes into being, and we are quite happy to have that. We're not necessarily looking for other things, but if you feel inclined to go deeper into that, i.e. meditation is to ponder, which is, we're talking about meditation in terms of consciousness. If you want to go deeper and read into music, nature, poetry, art, the sacred text, then you could say you are bringing about a deeper level transformation within yourself, within your psyche. So you could say the threshold experience of the Sambhogakaya, the body of perfect endowment, that to really embody the Bodhisattva or one of the Buddhas or the Buddha nature would mean that you would step outside of identification. You would not then need to translate that into culture, translate that into an experience. So you're really moving outside of the realm of experience. So even sitting in a concert, listening to music and going very, very deep into the numinous threshold, once you cross that threshold and you embody the how can I say, the heightened sense of awareness of listening to music with its numinous presence, then in a sense you can do it yourself. So you don't need to go to the music to get that. Not that you won't listen to music, but in a way you've graduated, as it were, or been initiated into that level, and that's become embodied and integral into your own nature. And I think that's what people do when they go into meditation as a practice. It's really about embodying the Buddha nature, not about self and the one, because if you're using your consciousness to meditate, then you're still identified with the ego. And that movement away from consciousness, and you embody the Bodhisattva, you embody love and truth and beauty, then you're no longer practicing meditation, you're in meditation, you're in real meditation. As it were. I mean, regardless of what you do, whether you think you're doing the right thing or not, and there are contradictions and confusions, and what I'm saying now may be clear or not clear, it may not be helpful, it may be helpful. Regardless of what I say or anybody else says or any book says, I mean, the subtle perceptions are available to everyone. The heightened awareness, as it were. Sensitivity to beauty and love and truth, and what you do with that is up to you. If you feel you need to meditate, but I would say, if you open your eyes, as it were, you can see in yourself these more subtle perceptions, and attuning yourself to these more subtle perceptions, I think you can bypass the desire or identification with meditation, with seeking anything. It's the same way. I mean, people can walk through the countryside walking their dog and be quite insensitive. Whereas if you are sensitive and the doors of perception are open, as it were, then that is meditation. And to have the confidence and integrity to work that out. Stand alone and do your own thing.